Hi everyone! In this tutorial I'll be walking you through the steps that I took to complete this graphite drawing of a chipmunk. Now it is a small piece, it's just 12 by 12 centimeters, and it was the perfect way to ease myself back into graphite while sharing approachable techniques that work especially well for beginners or anyone returning to drawing after a bit of a break. Now graphite has a special kind of charm. It's simple, it's affordable, and there's something calming about working in black and white. Without colour to think about, you can really focus in on your tones, textures and shapes. Now I began where I always like to start, and that's with the eye. It's such an important feature in any animal portrait. Now I use the HB pencil just to gently sketch in the shape, leaving a small highlight as clean white paper. And that highlight gives the drawing some life. From there, I slowly built up the depth using my 2B and 4B pencils. Light pressure was the key. Now if you go too dark too quickly, you'll lose that tooth of the paper, and that's when you'll risk that graphite shine. I also used very tiny circular motions just to layer the tone while still preserving that softness. Now, once the eye was done, I moved on to blocking in the base tones. Now I made my own graphite powder just by sanding down an 8B pencil on some sandpaper. It's really easy to do and it's much cheaper than buying the powder. I used a blending stump for the smaller areas and a makeup applicator for the larger ones. Now for all blending, I always follow the direction of the fur, even in these early layers, and that just helps everything flow more naturally later on. In the darker areas, like under the chin and across the upper back, I used a little more pressure, but in the lighter areas I made sure to ease off on that pressure so that I didn't get excess pigment going onto the paper. It's all about keeping those transitions soft and gradual, and I find it really helpful to keep looking at your reference and mentally divide the subject into those light, mid-tone and shadow regions before you add your powder. Now the paper I used for this one was the Strathmore Bristol 300 series, the smooth surface. And I found that that holds the graphite really nicely and allows for a nice clean blend. The pencils were from the Derwent graphic range, but any good quality graphite set would do. And I also like to use a mechanical pencil with a 2B lead just for those finer details like in the claws and the fur edges and whiskers. Now as I worked across the face and the body, I used my HB and 2B pencils to map out the mid-tones. And with graphite I do like to work from light to dark. Now around the face where the fur is short and soft, I kept the pencil strokes small and tight. I held the pencil at a nice low angle just to get those softer marks, and I used a chisel edge just for a bit more control and softness. Now down into the body and across the back, the fur does get longer, so my pencil strokes needed to as well. Throughout the process, I just made little adjustments. I noticed at one point the chin was looking a bit pointy, so I softened it, and that's totally normal. It's just part of refining the drawing as you go. I just used a kneadable eraser just to gently lift some of that graphite and reshape the area. And it's a really handy tool because it lets you just dab without disturbing too much of the surface. I also really like to use the Tombow mono eraser, and that's more for the sharper lines and those little highlighted flicks. Now the chipmunk stripe pattern was really fun to work on. I used the mechanical pencil to define the darker stripes along the back, and I paid close attention to the direction of the fur, even within those stripes, so that the texture remained consistent. To keep those stripes soft and natural, I just used small circular pencil motions in those fluffy areas, which helped avoid any harsh edges. In sections that felt too stark, I went back in with the paper stump and just slightly blended them in. Now once I had the major areas filled in, I returned to my blending stump just to smooth out any of those transitions. And again, I made sure it wasn't overloaded with pigment before moving into any lighter areas. And that way I didn't accidentally drag some of that dark graphite across those lighter sections. However, if this does happen, you can always lift it a little with your kneadable eraser and then just reblend. Now when it comes to the highlights, like I said, I love using the Tombow Mono eraser, and I just sharpen that to a bit of a point with my Stanley knife, and that just lets me flick out those individual hairs across the back, the head and the tail. It really helps to bring your drawing to life. I varied my pressure and made sure the lines followed that natural flow of the fur. And you can always rotate the razor to a new edge regularly just for those cleaner lines. Now for the finest details, I used a color shaper, which is just a little silicone tip tool that just lifts the graphite really well without damaging the paper. I used it around the edges and in the areas where I wanted to pull out softer, lighter hairs. And it's especially useful if you find that your Tombow Mono eraser's picked up just a bit too much graphite and just needs a little bit of refreshing. Now, because I was working on white paper, it can be tricky because without a background, your subject can look a bit flat. So to avoid that, I just use my HB pencil along with the mono eraser just to add some soft flicks around the edge of the chipmunk's body. And it just helps suggest those fine fluffy hairs, and it made the chipmunk feel a little bit more grounded. Now, if I was working on a toned paper, I would have done this a bit differently. For the tail, I went back to the graphite powder just to build up a soft base. And then I layered in the 2B and the 4B pencil strokes to show the longer, slightly coarse tail fur. The tail texture is different from the body, so I adjusted my strokes to reflect that. And I also made sure to taper the ends of the fur strokes so they didn't look too blocky. Now the foot area was really quite small, so I stuck to just the pencils for that part. And I used an HB to sketch in the shape, then the 2B to add some shadows and claws. Now I wasn't aiming for individual fur strands or anything here. It was more about creating the form through the tone and the shapes. A few highlights were added with the mono eraser, and the mechanical pencil just helped with those fine claw details. I paid close attention to the angles of the toes and the shadows under the foot to keep that anatomy of that foot and that claw believable. Now to ground the drawing, I just shaded underneath the chipmunk using some of that graphite powder and a makeup applicator. A little bit of a shadow just gives the illusion the chipmunk's actually sitting on something instead of just floating in space. I darkened the area just under the body slightly more, just to mimic a cast shadow. And for extra texture, I just used the side of my pencil just to add a few faint lines to suggest surface detail beneath him. Now once all the areas were in place, I like to just take a step back and have a look over my values. So I used my 6B and 7B pencils just to darken some key spots, especially around the nose, the eye, and the shadows along the belly. Getting those darker values in place really helps make the lights look even brighter. So I always like to just have a little squint at my drawing just to constantly check the contrast across the piece. So the whiskers came last, and since I wasn't working on a toned paper, I couldn't lift them out with my eraser. So I used my HB pencil to just gently draw them in. I kept the strokes nice and light and varied, making sure just to constantly check my reference image just for their placement and direction. A little flick with the colour shaper also just helped to soften those ends. I also added just a few final touches around the ear and the cheek area, because it's easy to overlook those spots, but the little extra attention there just helps frame the face nicely. If anything felt too harsh, I just went in with that blending stump or an eraser just to soften it. I tried my best to avoid overworking these areas and just to keep a sense of the lightness to it. So to finish off, I just use my mechanical pencil just to tidy up a few of those sharper edges, like around the ear, the base of the neck, and along the stripes. Now you can use a fine scribe tool to pop in any highlights or for your whiskers before adding your graphite, but that's not something I would normally do. Now when I was happy with everything, I just make sure that I brush off any loose graphite, which I do throughout the process anyway, and just make any final tweaks to the contrast that I think that the drawing needs. And that was it. So if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a like and a thumbs up. It will really help me grow my channel. And if you'd like to see more tutorials like this, both in graphite and pastel, be sure to hit that subscribe button. Also, if you'd like to draw this little chipmunk with me in real time, step by step, the full tutorial is available inside my Whiskers to Wildlife Academy. You'll also get the reference image, the line art, and the full material list. And you'll also get access to all of my other tutorials. I'll leave a link for that below this video, so please feel free to check it out. So thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.